In the Northeast, however, it was a different sort of experience, in that many of the revivals in the Northeast took place in colleges, places like Yale, Harvard, that were essentially ministry training schools at the time. Other people went there, but a lot of their focus was preparing ministers to preach, predominantly in the Congregationalist church there in New England. So, as the 1800s unfold, a man named Timothy Dwight becomes president of Yale. And Dwight has some traditional Orthodox views, particularly about the nature of God and some other things, whereas a lot of the professors at Harvard and then a lot of the students had been shaped by a view that said there was one God and that Jesus wasn't the Son of God and that the Holy Spirit wasn't God either. That there wasn't a Holy Spirit, it was just God. So a Unitarian versus a Trinitarian view.
Just one God and nothing else.
One God and nothing else. And not
This was who?
well, this is a lot of the ministers that are coming out of Yale, and so Timothy Dwight becomes president, and he believes that God is, yes, one, but God is also Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Right? So three and one. And so he starts, in his chapel talks, emphasizing traditional Christian teachings, making the case for traditional Christianity. And many of the students who had, not really been shaped by this, start converting, and in rather sizable numbers. And so there's a lot of revival that takes place in the Northeast, but the emphasis is more on this intellectual conviction of the reasonableness of Christianity, a moral defense of Christianity, but then also an emphasis on the social outcomes of Christianity, almost a social justice type of thing, even though that's a little bit, the term wouldn't necessarily be used, but some of the people that are converted that come out there and start preaching are not just concerned about people's souls, they're concerned about things like prison reform, ending slavery, getting rid of alcohol, literacy, all sorts of things, right? And so there's kind of this moral, social vision that they come out with as well. Not that people in the West didn't necessarily think that either as they became Christians, but really in the Northeast, there's a lot of emphasis on not just the individual conversion, but the social implications of a Christian society. The third area for revival for the Second Great Awakening is in the Middle Atlantic colonies. Now, these would be places like New York, Pennsylvania, I shouldn't say colonies, Mid-Atlantic states. Would include down into Maryland, Delaware, that's kind of the Mid-Atlantic region. One of the things that comes out of the Mid-Atlantic is a focus on the process of revival. Previously, a lot of people believed that revival happened when the Holy Spirit moved. And so the Holy Spirit was the one who brought revival, who encouraged revival and was causing revival. And human beings just kind of had to sit back and wait. So the preachers were still out there preaching, but at some point, you never knew when the Holy Spirit might bring about revival. One of the preachers in the Mid-Atlantic region was a man named Charles Finney. And he actually believed and promoted the idea that God wasn't necessarily choosing revivals at specific times, but was expecting human beings to be out there doing things that would bring about revival. And so if they were engaged in doing things that would bring about revival, God would give the increase, to use the terms of the Apostle Paul. And so he believed that there were certain actions or measures you could take that would bring about revival instead of just kind of sitting back and waiting for revival to take place on God's timetable. And so he would engage in these long meetings developed developed what was called the anxious bench. This was an idea that developed in the 1800s of calling people to the front of the church building or wherever you were gathered for them to kind of either pray for their salvation or to express the desire for conversion, instead of people just kind of possibly experiencing conversion. But essentially, within the churches of Christ, we call it the invitation. Right? There really wasn't that organized of an invitation in church services until this revivalism, when there was that moment at the end of the service where people would be invited forward to pray, to confess, those kind of things. And so it's some of those measures that get developed in the Mid-Atlantic in the 19th century that, of course, are still popular in a lot of variety of situations. So, for example, if you think of Billy Graham in the 20th century, who's a rather prominent revivalist, at the end of all of his crusades, where he would preach to these large audiences, there would be the altar call where people would be singing "Just As I Am," and other people would be streaming down to the front for prayer, talk to people, those kind of things. So and then of course the invitation being a part of a lot of congregations today as well. So out of the Second Great Awakening, you have this renewed interest in Christianity, openness to listening to a variety of religious groups, the belief that human beings had a say in whether or not they were saved. I mean, salvation is still by God, but it's not a matter of God has chosen you to be saved or lost. God's waiting for you to choose on that. And so those were some important things that come out of that.
So this is basically where some of this the ideologies.
Yeah, that they're kind of developing out of this, and then some of them get brought into the Restoration movement. Others of them are rejected. And so there's kind of
some people have their preferences.
Right. And so historically, this is kind of the situation that's developing in the United States, and this is the foundation that the Restoration movement thinkers are going to begin from. Before we get into the Restoration movement, I do want to talk about some early Restorationist movements in the United States, or the colonies in some cases, that are both important. They're not direct connectors to the American Restoration movement, Churches of Christ, Disciples of Christ, but are important things to see, because often people that join some of these groups, once Barton Stone, Alexander Campbell, and others started preaching their views on restoration, a lot of these people were converted to that. And so there's already some people talking about that. One was the example of the Republican Methodists. Essentially, the Republican Methodists start with the work of James O. Kelly, who was a Methodist in the Virginia, Maryland area. Converted to Methodism due to his son had converted first, and so he was brought about into that as well. Methodism had started as a group within the Church of England. It was started by a man named John Wesley. And essentially the goal behind Methodism was to try and, well, it was, in a sense, small groups. That the idea was that you would meet with in a smaller group with other people, other Christians, for Bible study, for weekly communion, to visit the sick, to encourage each other, and then, of course, on Sundays you'd gather with the rest of the Church of England in various worship services. And so originally when Wesley starts this, he starts it as a program within the Church of England. With the Revolution, however, it moves from being a part of the Church of England to being a separate denomination. part of that had to do with Wesley being opposed to the Revolutionary War, and so there was some, concern in the United States about that. But then also because of its connection with the Church of England, so that needed to be separate. And then also there were some other things that Methodists were beginning to believe in that was separating them. So Methodism starts to become a separate denomination, and Wesley sends over some people to the United States to serve as preachers, to serve as leaders, organizers. One of them is a man named Francis Asbury, who eventually gained some authority within the church, one of the highest leaders in Methodism. And O'Kelly has some problems with, some personal problems with Asbury. Doesn't particularly like him, doesn't like his leadership role. And so he leaves the Methodist Church with some of his friends. So they kind of split off and formed the Republican Methodists. Eventually, though, by 1801, they are simply calling themselves the Christian Church. So they start off as a Methodist group, but they get rid of the Methodist name, I guess, to kind of distinguish themselves from Methodists, but also because they believe that the name Christian is the only scriptural name that should be used. So you have that group in the Virginia, Maryland area, that Middle Colony area. In the Northeast, in New England, you have the development of the Christian Connection. And so while some of this is going on in Virginia, similar things are going on in New England. It is essentially organized by two men, one named Elias Smith and one named Abner Jones. They are the individuals that kind of begin this. Largely, they're coming out of the Congregationalist church as opposed to the Methodist church. And so the Congregationalist church, heavily Calvinistic, a lot of emphasis on Calvinism, and Smith begins to reject many of those things that Calvinism taught. He also begins to believe that the only name that should be used by followers of Jesus is Christian, that other types of names, of denominational names, shouldn't be used. He teams up with a man named Abner Jones, who says some other things, and so they begin preaching their distinct version of Christianity here. They will join to begin a new movement. In 1808, they begin publishing the Herald of Gospel Liberty, which is perhaps the first religious newspaper in the world. There were newspapers before, but as far as like a explicitly religious newspaper, just focused on religious issues, this appears to be one of the first, especially in the United States. Eventually, this group will join with part of the Republican Methodist group to take the name Christian Connection. So there's an interest in unity, there's an interest in this idea of using a Christian. After the Civil War, they will eventually become the United Church of Christ, after a merger with several other groups. And so if you've heard of the United Church of Christ, which isn't, it's still mostly Northeast. There aren't a lot of United Church of Christ in other places. They derive from this connection, this Christian connection, which united the Republican Methodists with some of the people that were following Smith and Jones. And after the Civil War, there's a couple other groups that they all kind of unite together. All right, so that gives us our foundation of thinking about the American situation, out of which the Restoration movement flowers. And so we're moving now into talking about some of the key movements, key developments, key figures that bring about the Restoration movement. And there are a lot of people that are involved in this, that are developing similar ideas, and we can already see in the people like James O'Kelly, Elias Smith, Abner Jones that are thinking similar things. But there are particularly two individuals that are especially important for the development of the Restoration movement in America. And Alexander Campbell is perhaps the more important, but we're going to start with the work of Barton W. Stone.